The blizzard outside the diner window was not merely a weather event. It was a wall of white hostility that had been building since the early afternoon, erasing the world one street lamp at a time. Inside the establishment, the air was stale with the scent of roasted coffee and the lingering grease of the dinner rush, though the customers had long since fled to the safety of their homes. Elena, a 25-year-old African-American waitress whose patience was as worn as the linoleum floor, tightened the strings of her red apron over her crisp, white shirt. She wiped down the counter with methodical, circular motions, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering neon sign that buzzed intermittently against the encroaching darkness. It was a night for ghosts and regrets, not for the living, and yet the bell above the door jingled with a fragile, freezing sound that cut through the low hum of the refrigerator. Elena looked up, expecting perhaps a stranded motorist or a local drunk seeking refuge, but the figure that stumbled through the doorway stopped her breath. It was an elderly woman, small and frail, wrapped in layers of expensive but soaked wool that clung to her shivering frame like a heavy shroud. The wind howled as the door struggled to close, finally clicking shut and sealing the silence once more. The woman stood there, disoriented, her silver hair plastered to her forehead, her eyes wide with a confusion that spoke of a mind lost in time as much as space. Elena did not hesitate. The instinct to nurture was a reflex honed by years of taking care of siblings and navigating a life that offered little quarter. She rounded the counter, her movements fluid and urgent, ignoring the wet slush tracking onto the floor.
"Ma'am,"
Elena asked softly, keeping her voice low to avoid startling the stranger. "You need to come sit down." "You're freezing," the old woman looked at her, blinking as if trying to decipher a foreign language, her lips trembling blue. Elena gently took her arm, feeling the bone-deep chill radiating through the wet coat, and guided her to the booth nearest the heater. The woman didn't resist. She seemed to have expended her last ounce of strength just to cross the threshold. Elena knew her manager would be furious if he knew she was keeping the lights on past closing, but looking at the grandmotherly figure shaking uncontrollably in the booth, the moral weight of the moment crushed any professional anxiety. Elena moved with a renewed sense of purpose, the weariness of her double shift evaporating under the heat of adrenaline and compassion. She went into the kitchen, the stainless steel surfaces gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, and set a pot of broth on the stove. While the soup heated, she returned to the dining area with a stack of clean, dry towels and a heavy wool blanket she kept in her locker for the nights she missed the last bus and had to sleep in the back office. The old woman was staring out the window at the swirling snow, her hand pressed against the cold glass. "It's dangerous out there," Elena murmured, draping the blanket over the woman's shoulders and beginning to gently dry her hair with a towel. The woman flinched at the first touch, but then leaned into the warmth, a heavy sigh escaping her lips. "He will be looking," the old woman whispered, her voice a cracked, brittle sound. "My son. He hates the cold." Elena paused, her heart softening at the mention of family. It was clear this woman was loved, likely lost, and someone out there was probably tearing the city apart looking for her. "We'll find him in the morning," Elena promised, her tone soothing and steady. "Right now, the phones are down because of the storm and the roads are closed. You're safe here." She returned to the kitchen and ladled the steaming broth into a ceramic bowl, adding soft noodles and vegetables, the aroma of ginger and garlic filling the empty space with a sense of home. When she placed the bowl in front of the woman, the elderly guest stared at it with a sudden clarity, tears welling in her eyes. She ate slowly, her shaking hands steadying with every spoonful, while Elena sat across from her, keeping a silent vigil. They didn't speak much. The language barrier was slight, but the barrier of exhaustion was greater, yet a profound understanding passed between them. Elena saw her own grandmother in the lines of this stranger's face, a universal recognition of vulnerability that demanded protection. As the storm raged on, burying the city in silence, Elena realized she couldn't send her away, nor could she leave her alone. She locked the front door, turned off the main sign, and prepared to wait out the long, frozen night in the booth opposite her guest, armed only with a pot of coffee and her own resolve. The morning sun did not rise so much as it exploded against the white landscape, a blinding brilliance that shattered the gray monotony of the storm. The snow had stopped, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of pristine, glittering powder. Elena woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping with her head on the table. The first thing she checked was the booth across from her. The old woman was still there, curled up beneath the wool blanket, breathing deeply in a rhythm of peaceful exhaustion. Elena exhaled, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and stood up to stretch, the silence of the diner feeling heavy and expectant. She walked to the window to gauge the road conditions, but what she saw made her blood run cold. The empty street, usually desolate at this hour, was filled with a convoy of sleek, black SUVs that looked like scars against the white snow. They were idling silently, their exhaust plumes rising in unison like smoke signals of war. Before she could even process the sight, the doors of the vehicles opened in synchronized precision. Men in dark, tailored suits stepped out, their breath visible in the freezing air, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a paramilitary unit. They didn't look like police, they looked like consequences. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she backed away from the window, her instinct to protect the sleeping woman warring with a rising tide of fear. The front door of the diner, which she had locked securely, rattled once before the glass was shattered not by a brick, but by a precise, heavy blow from a baton. The sound was deafening in the quiet space. The old woman stirred, waking with a gasp. Elena rushed to her side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder just as the door was pushed open. The men poured in, filling the diner with an aura of lethal menace. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. They simply secured the perimeter, their eyes scanning every corner until they landed on the booth. Then, the sea of dark suits parted, and a man walked in who made the others look like mere shadows. He was tall, perhaps 31, with a face that was devastatingly handsome but carved from granite, his expression devoid of anything resembling mercy. He wore a long cashmere coat over a suit that cost more than the diner itself, and his eyes were dark voids that seemed to absorb the light. This was Ji-hoon, and the energy in the room shifted around him, bending to his gravity. Ji-hoon's gaze swept over the diner with the precision of a predator assessing a trap, finally locking onto the two women in the booth. For a moment, the silence was absolute, a tension so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Elena stood up, placing herself physically between the man and the old woman, her hands trembling but her chin raised in defiance. She expected a weapon, a threat, a shout, anything but the quiet, intense scrutiny he leveled at her. "Move," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a request. Elena swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "She's sick," Elena said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror gripping her stomach. She was freezing. I just gave her soup and a place to sleep." Ji-hoon's eyes narrowed slightly, flickering from Elena's face to the red apron she wore, then to the old woman behind her. The woman, realizing who had arrived, let out a soft cry. "Ji-hoon-ah," she whispered, the sound fragile and relieved. The transformation in the man was instantaneous and jarring. The mask of the ruthless crime lord cracked just enough to reveal a terrified son. He pushed past Elena, not roughly but with an unstoppable force, and knelt beside the booth. He took his mother's hands, inspecting them for frostbite, touching her forehead, speaking to her in rapid, hushed Korean. The tenderness of the gesture was so at odds with his terrifying entrance that Elena felt a wave of vertigo. He listened as his mother spoke, her hands gesturing toward Elena, pantomiming the blanket, the soup, the kindness. Slowly, Ji-hoon stood up and turned back to Elena. The tenderness was gone, replaced by a complex, calculating look that was harder to decipher. He looked at the empty bowl on the table, the makeshift bed, and finally at Elena's tired, fearful face. He had expected to find his mother kidnapped, ransomed, or worse, dead in a drift. Instead, he found her warm and fed, guarded by a waitress who looked like she would fight an army to protect her. The dynamic in the room had shifted from an invasion to a judgment. Ji-hoon stepped closer to Elena, invading her personal space until she could smell the scent of expensive cologne and cold winter air clinging to him. The other men in the room remained statue still, waiting for a command. "You stayed here all night," Ji-hoon stated, not asking a question. "You could have called the police. You could have turned her out." Elena held his gaze, refusing to be cowed by his intensity. "I couldn't leave her in the storm," she answered simply. It wasn't right. Ji-hoon studied her, his eyes searching for a lie, a hidden motive, a demand for money. He found none. In his world, altruism was a myth, a weakness, or a deception. To find it here, in a rundown diner in the middle of a blizzard, was an anomaly that disrupted his entire calculus. He looked at her hands, rough from work, her simple clothes, the fatigue under her eyes. He was a man who believed that everything had a price, and that every debt must be paid. His mother was his only weakness, the only tether he had to his own humanity, and this woman had preserved it. A traditional reward, cash, a favor, seemed insufficient for the magnitude of what had been saved, and simultaneously, a new, opportunistic thought formed in his mind. He was under immense pressure from his organization's elders to settle down, to present a facade of stability, to bring a wife into the fold who could be trusted not to betray him. He looked at Elena and saw not just a savior, but a solution. She was brave, she was moral, and she was clearly unconnected to his treacherous world. I do not leave debts unpaid, Ji-hoon said slowly, his voice dropping to a register that felt like a caress and a command all at once. You saved the most important life in my world. Money is not enough, Elena blinked, confused. I don't want any money. I just did what anyone would do. Ji-hoon stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming her. No, he corrected her. Anyone else would have let her freeze or called the authorities to dump her in a shelter. You protected her, he paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. You are exactly what I require. I don't need to pay you, Elena. I need to claim you, the air in the diner crackled. My wife, he declared, the words hanging in the air like a sentence. You will be my wife. The declaration hung in the air, heavy and absolute, sucking the oxygen out of the diner until Elena felt lightheaded. She stared at Ji-hoon, waiting for the punchline, for the cruel smile that would indicate this was some twisted joke played by powerful men on the helpless. But his face remained a mask of stone, his dark eyes fixed on her with a frightening intensity that suggested he had already played out the next 10 years of their lives in his head. Elena took a step back, her back hitting the counter, the metal digging into her spine. You can't just say things like that, she stammered, her voice trembling but gaining volume as the absurdity of the situation washed over her. I'm not a thing you can claim. I saved your mother because she was freezing, not because I wanted a proposal from a mobster. She spat the last word out, regretting it instantly as the men behind him shifted, hands moving toward their jackets. Ji-hoon didn't flinch. Instead, he raised a hand to silence his subordinates, his gaze never leaving hers. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she was forced to look up at him, trapped between his imposing frame and the counter. You misunderstand the gravity of your position, Elena, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. My enemies are not fools. They track my mother. They know she was here. By the time the sun fully rises, they will know who you are. To them, you are now a leverage point. A weakness, he reached out, his gloved fingers grazing a stray curl of hair near her temple, a gesture that was terrifyingly intimate. If I leave you here, you'll be dead within the week. Or worse, they will use you to get to me. I am not offering you a romance. I am offering you a fortress, Elena's breath hitched. She looked at the old woman, who was watching them with sad, knowing eyes. The grandmother nodded slowly, confirming the nightmare. The realization hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. Her act of kindness had been a pebble thrown into a dark lake, and the ripples were now tsunamis threatening to drown her. So I have no choice. Elena whispered, the fight draining out of her as the reality of her small, fragile life crumbled against his power. There is always a choice, Ji-hoon replied, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. You can stay here and pray the shadows don't find you. Or you can come with me, take my name, and become untouchable. It wasn't a proposal of love. It was a transaction of survival, and looking into his void-like eyes, Elena knew she had already lost. The journey to the heart of the city was a surreal blur of motion and silence, a transition from the gritty reality of her life into a world that felt like a high-definition hallucination. Elena sat in the back of the lead SUV, sinking into leather seats that were softer than her bed at home. Ji-hoon sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, yet his presence filled the cabin like a pressurized gas. Outside the tinted windows, the city passed by. The snow-covered streets where she waited for buses, the corner stores where she bought groceries, all of it looking distant and small, as if she were viewing her past life through the wrong end of a telescope. She looked down at her hands, still red and chapped from the dishwater, resting awkwardly against the pristine interior of the car. She felt like an imposter, a rough sketch in a gallery of oil paintings. Ji-hoon seemed to sense her unease. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply took out his phone and began issuing commands in Korean, his voice sharp and authoritative. Elena caught snippets of tone that sounded like he was dismantling someone's existence, yet when he hung up, he turned to her with a calmness that was almost unnerving. "My home is secure," he said, breaking the silence. "You will have your own wing. You will not be touched unless you wish to be. But in public, you are mine. That is the price." Elena looked at him, searching for a trace of the monster she knew he must be. Instead, she saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the heavy burden of a man who held up the sky for everyone around him. "And your mother?" she asked quietly. "She stays with us," he confirmed. "She likes you." That is rare. The car slowed as they approached a towering glass spire that pierced the skyline, a monument to wealth and isolation. As the heavy iron gates rolled open, Elena felt a finality settle in her chest. The diner, the red apron, the struggle for rent, it was all gone. She was stepping into a cage, yes, but as the massive doors of the building opened to reveal a lobby of marble and gold, she realized it was a cage built to keep the wolves out, not just to keep her in. Time in the penthouse moved differently than it did in the world below. It was fluid, silent, and measured by the changing light on the floor-to-ceiling windows rather than the ticking of a clock. Elena had been living in Ji-hoon's fortress for 3 weeks, and the initial shock had worn off, replaced by a strange, tension-filled domesticity. Her wing of the apartment was larger than her entire previous apartment, filled with closets of designer clothes that fit her perfectly, a detail that unsettled her with its efficiency. Yet, she refused to play the part of the idle doll he perhaps expected. She spent her mornings with his mother, Mrs. Park, who taught her how to play wada cards and told her stories about Ji-hoon's childhood, chipping away at the myth of the ruthless crime lord to reveal the lonely boy beneath. One evening, the professional chef had prepared a French meal that was technically perfect but lacked soul. Elena, craving the heat and spice of comfort, had taken over the kitchen late at night to make a spicy stew, the smell of gochugaru and garlic permeating the sterile, modern air. She didn't hear Ji-hoon enter. He had returned from a meeting, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a dark bruise blossoming on his neck. He stood in the doorway, watching her hum as she stirred the pot, a look of profound confusion and longing on his face. When she turned and saw him, she didn't gasp. She simply reached for a bowl. "You look like you've been in a fight," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, sliding the steaming bowl across the granite island toward him.
"Eat."
"It helps." Ji-hoon stared at the food, then at her. In his world, women asked for jewelry or ignored the blood. They didn't offer sustenance. He sat down, the exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders, and took a bite. The heat of the spice hit him, grounding him. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why do you stay? The door is unlocked. The guards would stop you, but you haven't even tried." Elena leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Your mother needs me," she said, then hesitated. "And maybe I'm tired of being afraid of the world. Here, the monsters are at least polite." A ghost of a smile touched Ji-hoon's lips, the first genuine expression she had seen since the diner. "Not all of them," he murmured, meeting her eyes. In that shared silence, the transaction began to bleed into something else, a recognition of 2 survivors finding warmth in the snow. The fragile piece of their arrangement was shattered a week later, not by a bullet, but by an invitation. It was the annual Winter Gala, a gathering of the city's underworld elite masquerading as a charity event, and it was the stage Ji-hoon had chosen to debut his new wife. Elena stood before the mirror in a gown of deep crimson velvet, the color of blood and wine, which hugged her curves and trailed behind her like a royal train. A diamond necklace, cold and heavy, rested against her throat, a gift from Ji-hoon that felt more like a collar than jewelry. When she walked into the living room, Ji-hoon stopped dead. He was adjusting his cufflinks, but his hands froze. He looked at her not with possession, but with a reverence that made her breath catch. "You are formidable," he said, choosing the word carefully. But the night was not designed for compliments. The gala was a Shark Tank. The air in the ballroom was thick with cigar smoke and malice. Men smiled with their teeth while their eyes assessed weaknesses. Elena stayed glued to Ji-hoon's side, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, feeling the tension radiating from his muscles. The threat came from a rival boss, a man named Kong, who cornered them near the bar. Kong was drunk on power and champagne, his eyes sliding over Elena with a sickening familiarity. "So this is the waitress," Kong sneered, loud enough for the nearby circle to hear. "I didn't know you had a taste for the help, Ji-hoon. How much for an hour?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elena felt Ji-hoon's arm turn to steel beneath her fingers. She squeezed him, a silent plea for restraint, but it was too late. Ji-hoon didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply stepped forward, moving with a blur of speed, and in one fluid motion, he had Kong pressed against a marble pillar, a steak knife from a nearby table pressed intimately against the man's carotid artery. "She is not the help," Ji-hoon whispered, his voice carrying through the terrified hush of the room. "She is my life. Speak of her again, and I will cut your tongue from your head." He held the pose for a heartbeat, a tableau of beautiful violence, before stepping back and straightening his jacket. He took Elena's shaking hand. "We are leaving." As they walked out, hundreds of eyes followed them, but Elena didn't look down. She looked at him, realizing that the violence terrified her, but the fact that it was wielded entirely for her protection sparked a feeling she couldn't name. The drive back to the penthouse was silent, but the energy in the car was kinetic, charged with the adrenaline of a near kill. When they entered the apartment, Ji-hoon didn't go to his study or pour a drink. He turned to Elena, his face pale, the mask of the warlord finally slipping to reveal the terrified man beneath. "I cannot do this," he said, his voice cracking. He paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I could use you. I thought I could protect you. But I was arrogant. Tonight proved it. You are a target because of me." He stopped and looked at her, his eyes burning with a desperate resolve. "I have a plane waiting at the private airfield. It will take you to Europe. New identity, enough money to live like a queen for 10 lifetimes. You leave tonight." Elena stood frozen, processing his words. He was setting her free. He was tearing up the contract because he cared more about her life than his reputation. It was the ultimate act of love from a man who didn't know how to love. The easy choice was to run, to take the money and vanish into a safe, anonymous life. But she looked at him, standing alone in his glass tower, surrounded by enemies, with no one but his mother to anchor him, and she knew she couldn't do it. She crossed the room slowly, the sound of her heels clicking on the floor. She reached out and took his hands, which were still trembling from the adrenaline of the gala. "No," she said firmly. Ji-hoon looked at her, stunned. "Did you not hear me? They will come for you. Let them come," Elena replied, her voice steady, surprised by her own courage. "You saved me from a life of nothing. I'm not going to leave you to face this alone. I'm not just a waitress anymore, Ji-hoon. And I'm not just a contract." She reached up, cupping his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. "I'm your wife." The word hung there, no longer a sentence, but a promise. Ji-hoon let out a shuddering breath, his forehead resting against hers, surrendering to the connection he had tried so hard to deny. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her neck. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the city in white. But inside, for the first time, it wasn't cold.